Adolf Hitler's death came on April 30th, 1945, but victory celebrations would have to wait. Here's what it was like on the day that signaled the long-awaited beginning of the end. By April 30th, 1945, the Soviet Red Army had Berlin in a chokehold. The Battle of Berlin, one of the deadliest engagements of the war, began about 10 days earlier and didn't end until May 2nd. Russian soldiers wanted revenge for brutal German offenses like the Battle of Stalingrad, where official Russian estimates claimed more than 1 million military and 40,000 civilian deaths. So when it came time for the Red Army to descend on Berlin, they did so with a fury. Besides gunfire and shelling, accounts of widespread sexual assault were later reported. By that point, the German outlook was bleak. Many soldiers were just teenagers with bare minimum of weapons. Heinz Reinhardt was one of those German teen soldiers. He told American Experience that even when the news came that Hitler was dead, we thought we had to fulfill our duty at the position where we had been stationed. The young soldiers tried to fight back, but they knew it was hopeless. According to Reinhardt, we were jaded and callous and accepted everything as it came, and maybe that enabled us on an everyday basis to survive. With the Red Army closing in, Hitler was hiding in a reinforced 18-room bunker near his headquarters. He'd gone down into hiding on January 16th. By April 22nd, he got word that a massive, if foolhardy, counterattack that he'd ordered was impossible. Hitler apparently broke down at the news, loudly proclaiming that Nazi Germany was doomed. The reassurances of those around him did little to comfort Hitler, who knew he was defeated.
Only then did Hitler decide to die. The last picture.
It's almost certain that the news of Italian dictator Benito Mussolini's brutal death had something to do with Hitler's decision to put one in his temple rather than fall into the hands of the Soviets. After Mussolini was killed by partisans, his remains, along with those of his mistress Clara Petacci and 14 others, were dumped in a public square in Milan and mutilated by an angry mob.
Bombastic Mussolini, the sawdust Caesar, comes to his end in the gutter.
In order to spare himself a similar fate, Hitler ordered that his body be cremated. He then decided to marry his longtime partner Eva Braun, as Russian bombs fell around them. After what must have been a depressing wedding, Hitler completed his political testament and private will, dictating them both to his secretary, Traudl Junge. She typed it up while a wedding reception with liverwurst sandwiches and champagne took place. Then it was time. According to Junge's book, Until the Final Hour, by April 30th, Braun and Hitler made their final goodbyes. Braun gave Junge her fur coat and urged her to try and escape Berlin. Hitler gave Junge a cyanide capsule. According to valet Heinz Linge's memoir, With Hitler to the End, Hitler told him to do his best to leave the city, then said, "Linge, I'm going to shoot myself now."
Promised that he would never be captured alive. He also said he was not going to leave Berlin, that he realized this was his fate.
Shortly after, aides found the couple dead on a sofa in Hitler's room. Propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, his wife Magda, and their 6 children had also been staying in the bunker. The day after Hitler's death, he and Magda poisoned their children and then also died by suicide. The first liberation of a large concentration camp came in July 1944, when Soviet troops moving through Lublin, Poland, uncovered the half-dismantled Majdanek. Some prisoners remained, but many had been moved to camps like Auschwitz, which would be liberated by the Red Army in January 1945. Though Nazis had attempted to do away with much of the evidence at Majdanek, enough remained to speak of the atrocities committed there, from the accounts of surviving prisoners to the mountains of personal items and 14,000 pounds of human hair. As Russian troops moved further into Germany, they discovered more concentration camps, human remains, and starving, disease-afflicted survivors. In his oral history, U.S. soldier Andrew Tim Canary told the National World War II Museum about his gut-wrenching experience liberating Buchenwald.
But I don't think they told us what we were getting into.
By April 29th, U.S. troops had liberated Dachau, where they found a death train containing thousands of abandoned human remains. There, American soldiers in a fit of rage executed at least 50 German soldiers and camp staff. Beyond those who handled Hitler's remains on April 30th, the circumstances of his death weren't clear that day, or for a long while after. In the chaos, many wondered if Hitler had escaped. A May 1945 report in Time magazine acknowledged that Hitler was almost certainly dead, but then referenced conflicting causes of death, and even the notion that Hitler was alive but being held by the head of the Gestapo, Heinrich Himmler.
Adolf Hitler's death certificate is not issued until 1956, 11 years after his death.
Why the confusion? For one, the Soviets got involved. It was long rumored that Red Army soldiers salvaged some of Hitler's remains, but this wasn't confirmed until 2018 when skull and jaw fragments held by Russia were positively identified using Hitler's X-ray and dental records. The skull portion shows what appears to be a close-range gunshot wound, consistent with first-hand accounts from within the bunker. Still, many people clung to the idea that Hitler was still alive, either because they weren't ready to give up on the idea of Nazi Germany or because they wanted Hitler publicly brought to justice. But even before the final physical evidence came to light, first-hand reports and official investigations confirmed that Hitler had died on April 30th, 1945. After Hitler's suicide, the survivors in the bunker faced a serious question: what to do with the bodies. Hitler had instructed his aides to make sure his remains were destroyed, so that's what they did. A group of SS officers wrapped Hitler's disfigured corpse in a blanket and hauled it up 4 flights of stairs into an open area just outside the bunker, along with the remains of Eva Braun. The bodies were laid in a bomb crater, then soaked with gasoline, after which some papers were lit and tossed onto the corpses. One of the few outside witnesses to this event, Eric Mansfield, a guard on duty in a nearby observation tower, heard the commotion and went down to investigate. He reported seeing a concealed corpse wearing black pants and the unwrapped identifiable remains of Braun. After being yelled at by the bunker staff, he returned to the tower. From there, he witnessed the moment the bodies were set on fire, as did another guard, Hermann Karnow. Many scientists in the crumbling German state understood that their information about nuclear weapons research made them targets. By 1943, a secret Allied unit known as the Alsace Mission, or Lightning A, led by U.S. Colonel Boris T. Pasch, had begun investigating the Nazi atomic program. By April 22, 1945, Pasch's team had made its way ahead of Allied forces into Heidelberg, where they uncovered a nuclear lab and quickly set about destroying the reactor. They also recovered files fleeing scientists had submerged in a cesspool, along with uranium and other radioactive materials buried nearby. Just 2 days after Hitler's death, Lightning A detained a group of German scientists, including top Nobel Prize-winning physicist Werner Karl Heisenberg. Heisenberg was held for a brief time, then set free, but rocket scientist Werner von Braun emerged from hiding in Austria to surrender.
You know about Operation Paperclip, right?
Government recruitment of German scientists after the war.
That's right. From there, von Braun became an employee of the U.S. Army and later NASA, where he led the team developing the Saturn V rocket that eventually carried Apollo 11 astronauts to the moon.
No civilized country, like Germany, can wage a war without its cities. If we burn down their cities, then we have won.
Beginning on April 23rd, Berlin was completely surrounded and bombarded by artillery that destroyed buildings and took many lives. Encounters between Allied forces and German troops, as well as civilians, resulted in even further damage. Even worse was the state of Dresden. By February 1945, Dresden had been almost entirely razed by a bombing campaign meant to instill shock and despair, and it did. Most estimates claim somewhere between 25,000 to 35,000 civilians were killed in the firebombing campaigns against Dresden alone, though others argue that that number could have been far higher due to an influx of people who were either hiding in Dresden or working undocumented in the factories there. Over in Japan, Tokyo had also been subject to a brutal firebombing campaign that some have deemed the worst act of war in history, and that includes the nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yeah, it was that bad. On the night of March 9, 1945, around 100,000 people were killed in the firestorm set off by Allied bombers above Tokyo. 1 million more were left without homes. Even if they weren't directly harmed by enemy troops or bombs, people worldwide experienced supply chain disruptions, wartime rationing, and the movement of refugees. And most nations continued to grapple with the economic and social aftershocks of the conflict after it was over. Even while Hitler was still alive, the Cold War had begun to germinate. Tensions among the Allies became obvious at the February 1945 Yalta Conference, where British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, US President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin met to plan the post-war world. Though World War II wasn't officially over, the writing was on the wall. Hitler had fled to his bunker, the war in the Pacific had begun to sour for the Japanese as they lost more and more territory, and fascist Italy was beginning to crumble. It was time for the victors to come up with a plan for the aftermath. The European presence of Stalin's Red Army eclipsed that of Britain or the US. All three had different goals, and neither FDR nor Churchill was especially keen on letting the Soviet Union become an even more dominant world power. But they had no one to rely on but each other, so they hammered out a deal that included a Germany split into different zones, as well as an agreement for the United Nations to officially begin its mission. FDR also got Stalin to agree to invade Japan if circumstances called for it. Churchill never got an assurance of an independent Poland, however. At the Yalta Conference, it was clear that President Roosevelt was unwell, and just 2 months later, he was dead of a stroke.
As his cousin Daisy Sulkley said, Franklin Roosevelt, the hope of the world, has died.
Though he was 63 years old and had just been elected to a 4th term, Roosevelt was suffering from shockingly high blood pressure and heart failure, not to mention the stress of the presidency. Perhaps if everyone had known the true extent of the president's health problems, his sudden death on April 12, 1945 would have been less of a surprise. Vice President Harry Truman rushed to the White House, where he was greeted by Eleanor Roosevelt, who delivered the news. When he asked how he could help, the First Lady reportedly replied, "Is there anything we can do for you? For you are the one in trouble now."
He has no staff, no one around him, no cabinet members who are his picks. He is entirely on his own.
The public heard of the president's death within 2 hours, and at about the same time that Truman was sworn in as president. On the day of Hitler's death, the young United Nations was in the midst of one of its earliest meetings. 46 nations were invited to San Francisco, where they signed on to the United Nations Declaration, along with 4 other nations to make a total of 50. Beginning on April 25th, around 850 official delegates met and approved the organization's charter and the framework for the International Court of Justice. This was the moment many consider to be the creation of the UN. President Truman delivered an address to the conference via wire. After paying tribute to the recently deceased FDR, he said, "By your labors at this conference, we shall know if suffering humanity is to achieve a just and lasting peace." Truman, and surely everyone who listened to or read the address, was clearly reflecting on the bloody war that was only then grinding to a close. He went on to say, "The essence of our problem here is to provide sensible machinery for the settlement of disputes among nations. Without this, peace cannot exist. If we do not want to die together in war, we must learn to live together in peace."